He holds his doctorate from Yale University. He's currently assistant professor of ancient Mediterranean religions at Iowa. And his range of interests ranges across the Egyptian Coptic world, the Syriac world, its way is remarkable. Here's somebody who commands Syriac and Coptic. And if I had to summarize what he's interested in, it is the contacts, the interactions between cultures across societies and across continents. And his breadth is amazing, so I hate the man. Thank you very much, Paul Dilley.
Thank you, Philip, for that gracious introduction. And for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. This is only my second time in Texas, and it's a lovely campus and a wonderful.
Rains every day.
That's true.
Yeah, very tropical it feels. So today I'm going to be talking about Syriac Christianity understood very broadly, so Aramaic speaking and actually a lot of Manichaeism in there, more on that in a minute, and situating it within the religious diversity of early Sasanian Iran. So the Sasanian dynasty, sometimes called the Sassanid dynasty, is the last of the ancient Iranian dynasties, and for about, just to give you very brief background here, for about 400 years, it was sort of the evil empire in Rome's eye, and the two fought each other on and off for the duration of that time. So you can think of it as kind of an extended Cold War, if you like. Of course, in most university curriculums in the U.S., Sasanian Iran gets short shrift. So it is kind of falls under the rubric of these cultures which we need to step back and just take a basic look at in many ways, but especially for us today in terms of the religious diversity. So it's got actually a fairly astounding religious diversity, which I hope to just give you a brief introduction to. So my undergraduate teacher, Helmut Kester, who I took New Testament and early Christianity with, used to kind of preach Bauer's orthodoxy and heresy in early Christianity as a kind of gospel, an apocryphal gospel, if you will. So Bauer's thesis is rather simple, that if you look at the various regions of the early church, Orthodoxy came late. What you have with the earliest evidence is a diversity of heresies. And interestingly enough, so Syriac Christianity is part of the map for Bauer. He touches on Edessa. Indeed, he starts the entire book with a survey of the diversity of early Christianity within Edessa. But he doesn't go further south, southern Mesopotamia. Edessa is part of the Roman Empire, so southern Mesopotamia is part of the Sasanian Empire proper. And if we don't know a whole lot about Edessene and Syriac Christianity in the first 3 centuries, we know far, far less about the southern Mesopotamian version in Sasanian Iran. So even though Bauer didn't go this far, I can sort of play his game here. And the earliest kind of orthodox evidence we have for the establishment of the Church of the East in the early apostolic century is a text called the Acts of Mar Mari. So Mari is said to have been an apostle of Adai, who is said to have been the apostle of Edessa. And according to these 6th century Acts, Mari went to Nisibis and then further south to the Seleucia Ctesiphon, the capital of Sasanian Iran, and was the evangelist of Seleucia Ctesiphon and the founder of the Church of the East. And there is, after his foundation, a sort of genealogy of subsequent patriarchs of Seleucia Ctesiphon. Now, the earliest, quote-unquote, historical patriarch, Papa Bar Agai, we know him from other documents to have been the head of the Seleucia Ctesiphon church, the bishop, at the kind of turn of the century, so around 285-91, all the way through to 327. But before that, according to Mari actually immediately passes on the office of bishop in Seleucia to Papa, but that's actually kind of overlooking this 300 years. So in this 300-year period, that's what I'm going to be looking at today. And by and large, our best evidence for early Christianity is closely connected to Manichaeism, which Orthodox Christians didn't call Christian at all, in fact, although Manichaeans self-identified as Christians. And they spoke a dialect of Syriac, a dialect of Aramaic, very close to Syriac, sort of a southern version of it, of which we don't know much at all. The earliest, generally, there are 2 3rd-century treatises which are put forward as evidence for Christians in the Sasanian Empire. So Bardizan, who is a philosopher Christian writing in Edessa, he is trying to argue here against fate, and he mentions Parthians. Parthia is a part of the Persian Empire who do not take wives, and then Kushans in the eastern Sasanian Empire, part of northwest India. Those who are in Persia do not marry their daughters. So the point is here that they don't follow the customs of the places where they are. And this is generally held to be the earliest or the best evidence that Christians have spread through the Sasanian Empire. A colleague has recently argued that this assertion is actually not based on Bardizan having traveled in the area, but is probably going back to a lost Acts of Thomas. Thomas is usually best known as the apostle to India, but there's a lost Acts of Thomas which places him as the apostle to the Sasanian Empire, Parthia being the earlier version of that, the earlier dynasty. So what I'm trying to get at here is simply that we do not have good evidence for early Christianity in the Sasanian Empire before about the 3rd century. And again, Manichaeism, as we'll see, is going to be our best evidence. So that's just a bit of a prologue, and I'm going to real quickly just give you an outline of the presentation here. So I'm going to start with looking at what we do know about early Christianity in Sasanian Iran by means of an inscription, which I think is our first bit of evidence for it, which also demonstrates the religious diversity of Sasanian Iran. So we'll take a brief bird's eye view of that. Then I'm going to talk about how these various religious groups in the 3rd century are going through a transition from primarily oral-based worship and education to a writing down of sacred texts, so a transition from orality to scripture. I'm going to examine that process by looking at Mani's, what he calls the living gospel, so the most famous text of Manichaeism, which he himself wrote, and I'm going to compare it to the central Zoroastrian prayer, or one of them, the Ahuna Vairya, both of which I argue as a result of this period where scripture becomes important, they put forward a kind of alphabetic theology. And then more generally, I'm going to look at the use of the alphabet in this period where we're transitioning from sacred word to sacred script, the alphabet as a way of Proto-Canon, a way of measuring things and trying to denote a sort of completeness in one's religious literature. So I have to warn you that 3 and 4 are sort of research in progress, so I'm kind of floating this and hope to get feedback and thoughts, just including about the coherence of the argument. So please, I look forward to hearing what you have to say. So what is the earliest bit of evidence for Christians in the Sasanian Empire? Well, it's this rock inscription, I would argue, from the 3rd century. So this is probably towards the later end of the 3rd century, by a magos, or mage, by the name of Kartir. His name is transcribed in various ways. Kartir, you may also see it. He spoke Middle Iranian, which was the language of the ruling class, and also the Zoroastrian priests. So in the early Sasanian Empire, he is probably the one most responsible for establishing Zoroastrianism as we could think of it as the state religion of Sasanian Iran. So in contrast to the Roman Empire, where Christianity eventually became the state religion, that never happened in the Sasanian Empire. So through the duration up till the Arab conquest in the 7th century, Zoroastrian religion was the state religion of Sasanian Iran. So that's a key difference with the later Christian Roman Empire. So the mage Kartir, he set up a bunch of inscriptions. There are 4 actually, but in one of them he talks about how he persecuted the other religions. So he says, and in the realm, that is the realm of the Sasanian Empire, Jews, Buddhists, Hindus, so Jews, Buddhists, and Hindus, Christians are towards the end of this list, Nazarene Christians, and other Christians, so there's the term Nazarii, and there's also the Christianoi, and then a group called the Baptists, a mysterious group. There is actually great debate as to which of several possibilities they represent. More on that. And then there are the Zondigs. The Manichaeans are labeled actually as Zondig probably means in Middle Persian a misinterpreter of the Zoroastrian scriptures. So from Kartir's point of view, the Manichaeans are Zoroastrian heretics. From the Christian point of view, they're Christian heretics. From Mani's point of view, they're Christians, basically. Anyway, so all of these groups of religions, and Kartir says he struck them down. He also notes that idol temples were destroyed, and the dens, den is, we could translate it as a religion here. I don't know why Sherva didn't translate it. The den of the foreign gods were ruined and turned into thrones and seats for the gods. And throughout the realm, services to the gods were greatly increased. These are the Zoroastrian gods. So Kartir is basically boasting about how he saw religious, cosmologically speaking, he saw a battle between good and evil, and so he's using, scholars don't think he actually instituted serious long-term persecutions of Jews and Christians and these other religions at this point. He's speaking metaphorically of the battle between good and evil, and how whatever persecutions he did administer was a way of increasing the good and diminishing the evil. So he had this kind of worldview, which we'll see that Mani and Manichaeans shared. Anyway, so that shows the Christians, several different types of Christians, plus the Manichaeans, also in there with Jews and Buddhists and Baptists. So I'm just going to quickly run through some of the other religious groups that early Sasanian Christians were in contact with. So we have the capital here. By the way, this southern Mesopotamia is sort of the heartland of the Sasanian Empire. Egypt is often called the breadbasket of the Roman Empire, and southern Mesopotamia is the breadbasket of the Sasanian Empire. So similar connection there. Anyway, Jewish southern Mesopotamia is Seleucia Ctesiphon is the Iranian capital. That's where the Shah was. The Mahoza is a center there. Nehardia is where the Exilarch, the leader of the Jewish community in exile, is based. And then Pumbedita and Sura were the site of yeshivot, schools, rabbinic academies, which ultimately produced the Babylonian Talmud, which is a major foundational document of most forms of contemporary Judaism. So anyway, that all is in the air, so to speak, in the 3rd century, and Kartir mentions it in his inscription. I'll point to my colleague Shai Secunda has a book, The Iranian Talmud, just to give you a sense of the ways in which different religious groups might interact with one another in this kind of melting pot of groups. So he points to, among other things, rabbis who knew not only Aramaic and Hebrew, but also Middle Persian. Somehow they got Middle Persian translations of the Bible. Unfortunately, we don't have those except for a couple of little bits. There was some intermarriage, especially near the capital. Shai points to rabbis studying with the Magi, the religious teachers, a common interest in magic. So we know from Aramaic incantation bowls, there are also Christian incantation bowls, that Persians tended to go to Jewish vendors of these bowls. And also fascinating references to debates before the Sasanian court. And a document I'm editing in Coptic, actually, an early Manichaean text, also presents evidence for these debates before the Sasanian court. So all of this is specifically the Jewish Zoroastrian contact, but we can imagine similar things going on with the Christians and with the Manichaeans. Who are those Baptists? Well, probably there is the most likely candidate is a group called the Mandeans. They have their own dialect of Aramaic and a rather vibrant religious literature, a lot of which has not been edited because it's sort of secret and priestly. Much of it has. There's a massive debate on when to date it, but some of the early stuff is very closely connected to early Manichaean hymns. So, regardless of the debate as to who the Mandeans were, did they exist in the 3rd century? Probably, I think on evidence, it's likely that these are the Baptists that Kartir was talking about. They also are, there are very small groups left in southern Iraq and Iran, but are a fast dwindling religious minority in a global diaspora. Some of their major population centers now are Sydney and Detroit. This is a picture of a baptism in the Tigris River. However, in the late 90s, in the various places where they go, they conduct their rituals in other forms of running water. So I actually saw them conduct a baptism in the Charles River in Cambridge in the late 90s. So they, it's an adaptable religion, but a dwindling one. And now let's talk about the Manichaeans. So this is the seal, possibly a colleague of mine in art history, Shoshana Gulashi, has recently argued that this may have actually been on evidence the actual seal that Mani used to stamp his documents in the Sasanian Empire. So that is Mani there in the middle. Quite interesting and rare if it's actually true that we get, this isn't exactly a self-portrait, but pretty close to how Mani would have wanted himself presented. So that is Mani the sage, surrounded by 2 apostles. And so who is this Mani guy? Well, let me just run you through some of the basic points of Manichaeism. So Manichaeism, like Zoroastrianism, and this may have been why Kartir called him a kind of heretical Zoroastrian, they thought that the world as it exists today and its materiality is actually a mixture of the kingdom of light and the kingdom of darkness. So there's a long-term war that began when the kingdom of darkness became aware of the existence of the kingdom of light and attacked it. And as a result of this, part of the war was for the Father of Greatness, the God of Light, to send an evocation called Primal Man to fight the darkness, but he gets enveloped by it. It's almost like a sort of bait, so the darkness kind of focuses on it, and that's the boundary. It doesn't go further to attack the light. And the work of salvation is to basically, and this is the work that the Manichaean elect do through various rituals, is to help free the light particles which are trapped in the darkness and help bring them upward. They have a very mechanical cosmology through the sun, the moon and the sun, and upwards back to the kingdom of light. And among other things, one of the famous ceremonies is the catechumens, the hearers, bring the elect various kinds of vegetables like cucumbers, which were thought to have a high percentage of light particles, and they eat them and then belch them out with the songs. So very interesting stuff. They had hyper low carb diet, the elect, under 1,000 calories. And I actually argued my other hat, I do Egyptian monasticism. There's an Egyptian monastic author, Shenouda, who is plausibly dated to have lived about 118 years, which, as far as I know, for a man would be about the record period, but plausibly, I mean, as far as external evidence. And the answer, perhaps, is that he practiced an ultra-low-carb diet. Some people say Egyptian monasticism developed out of Manichaeism. Anyway, my talk is way too long for those tangents. I apologize for that. I'll try to stay on topic here. So anyway, the salvation of the light particles is a key part. And you may think, well, how is this Christian? Well, much of this sort of evidence is taken from Mani's interpretation of the Christian scriptures. Mani used what's called the diatessaron, kind of for a harmony of the four Gospels. He was a really big fan of the Apostle Paul, and in fact, he tried to model himself. He saw himself as a second Paul. And finally, he used a lot of apocryphal literature, like the Gospel of Thomas. So primarily, he saw himself in the Christian tradition. However, he also presented himself as the heir of other prophets like Jesus, Buddha, and Zoroaster. So he tried to also bring in especially Zoroastrian religion and to a lesser extent Buddhism. And so what I'll try to do in this talk is show how some of his claims actually, you can see him in dialogue with Zoroastrian material and also with Buddhist material, especially from the Kushan region, Gandhara, kind of modern Afghanistan, which was in the Iranian cultural orbit at that time. And so there are new sources for Manichaeism. Not all of them have been edited yet. I'm working with a couple of colleagues on editing the Chester Beatty Kephalaya Codex, which is a Manichaean text, which is dealing with Mani's debates, especially at the court of the Persian kings. We haven't actually published the thing yet. That volume was just a series of preliminary studies. It's a 360-page book. It's a mess. It's in a real tatters, I think is how a colleague described it. Ink faded, so using all sorts of multispectral imaging to try to reconstruct it. But in any case, it's given us a lot of evidence for Mani's debates with other religions. So this is at the Chester Beatty Library, working with Ian Gardner over there. This is my colleague Jason Badoon. And then there's me, and you may ask, well, why do you have the computer open if you're also looking at the text? And you could call this a kind of blended process where it's good to have computer-enhanced images, but it's best to, when you're doing an edition, to also work with the physical copy in hand. So I've spent way more time in the Chester Beatty Library than I ever thought I would spend in Ireland, period. And everybody makes fun of me. I've never been out of Dublin because everybody else just stays in Dublin for a couple of days and hits the countryside. I've never been there. I'm perpetually stuck in Dublin. So anyway, this is just a sample to show you the kind of, this is what dealing with some ancient texts is like. The papyri have not been well preserved, and we use various image enhancement techniques to try to get the writing to show up on the page. And frankly, it hasn't worked as well as we wish it had, but we've certainly made great strides with it. Anyway, so what that material has done, among other things, what we've discovered is a lot of evidence for a general process in which primarily oral-based religions become textual. And among other things, we found early evidence for Mani debating with Zoroastrians who invoke a law of Zorades. Zorades is a Greek form of Zarathustra, the prophet of Zoroastrianism, which had, this is the earliest evidence for actually a written version of this law. I argue that what it is basically the ancient the ancient Zoroastrian scripture, which is ascribed to Zarathustra, is in a very ancient 2nd century BCE language called Avestan, and in the time of Mani, nobody understood it all that well, but those who did knew it well enough to make translations of it into Middle Persian. So this is what's called the Zand, the interpretation. And so what I think was going on here is Mani is debating with Zoroastrian teachers who have a written form of their Middle Persian translation of the Avesta. So a transition from orality to textuality, which we also see in the rabbinic material. So the Mishnah or the Oral Torah is written down at around 200 in the Roman Empire and is circulating in 3rd century Mesopotamia in the rabbis there as well. And Mani was sort of ahead of the curve in this process because he argued that one of the main, he has a list of 10 reasons why Manichaeism is the best. And one of the main reasons is that Mani wrote down himself his own scriptures, and he says, well, look at my illustrious colleagues and predecessors. They didn't do that. So their followers wrote it down after them. And as a result of this, that was corrupted. So the earlier texts were corrupted. So similar to later Islamic arguments about Jewish and Christian scriptures. So in any case, this is Jesus is also in the picture here. Mani says Jesus didn't write down the Gospels, it was his followers. So these are Manichaean scribes. Philip showed this earlier. This is actually from Central Asia. Manichaeans had a good deal of luck on the trade routes on the Eastern Silk Road, and much of our Manichaean material is actually in Iranian languages. Mani wrote in Iranian as well as Aramaic, although his primary language was Aramaic. It was translated and went east. This was found on a site in the Silk Road called the Turfan Oasis. So what was Mani's major gospel? So he wrote early, he wrote his own stuff. What did he write? Well, the Living Gospel is the main text of Mani. And unfortunately, we know that it was first. We know that he wrote about 6 other canonical writings, but this was the big one. This was the most important. He may have written something earlier called the Shaboragan, but he didn't write it in Aramaic. He wrote it in Middle Persian. It's called Shaboragan because it was sort of not a canonical treatise, but a kind of explanation of his teachings to the Iranian Shah, Shapur. Anyway, so the Living Gospel is first. It's important. It's gospel probably more in the Pauline sense of Mani's good news than in the written gospel sense, 4 Gospels or Diatessaron, in that it's not another. Mani refers to Jesus' life, but it's not a kind of narrative account of Jesus' life. It's more like a miscellany. In the opening sections, he talks about cosmogony. He talks about other religions. He gives episodes from his own life. So it's sort of hodgepodge rather than a narrative gospel, I think, anyway. And what's interesting is he organized it into writing is important for him, and it was more than important, however. So he, as a southern Mesopotamian, he spoke a dialect of Aramaic, and he wrote the Living Gospel and divided it up into 22 sections corresponding to the 22 letters of the Aramaic alphabet. So the reason that he did this, I think, is because he called himself the apostle to Babylon. and in Babylon, they spoke Aramaic. And as we'll see, he looked at Aramaic as a sacred language that was involved in creation and revelation, and also a sacred script, as I'm going to argue. So Mani, as the apostle to Babylon, he actually writes this in the introduction. We only have fragments and quotations from the Living Gospel, but in one of these quotations from a later Islamic author, al-Biruni, he says that he is the apostle of truth in the land of Babylon. He also has universal aspirations. So he says that his gospel is going to be the first to spread throughout the world. So that it's interesting that despite these universal aspirations, he also has a very fixed regional identity as the apostle to Babylon. So he speaks Babylonian Aramaic, and also a little bit of Middle Persian because he's in the Persian Empire. So Ephraim talks about the Babylonian Mani, and the Acts of Marmari, which scholars have argued has a lot of allusions to Manichaeism. It tries to kind of one-up Manichaeism, also presents Mari as the apostle to the children of Babylon. And I also give you a Parthian hymn, which is probably in Mani's voice. Well, he says, I'm a grateful student, Talmud a disciple who sprouted from the land of Babel. I sprouted from the land of Babel and have stood at the gate of truth, a young student who went forth from the land of Babel that I might call a call in the world. So this revelation, and as we'll see, Aramaic is the language of revelation, both in terms of the spoken word and in terms of the Aramaic script, which he used to organize his living gospel. So Syriac, if we, to try to get a feel for Mani and why he thought Aramaic was so holy, it is in the broader tradition of trying to identify a primordial language. So Greek authors, Greek Christian authors, generally the general consensus is that Hebrew was the primordial language, that is the language God spoke during creation, and also the language of paradise. Most Syriac authors, most might be controversial now, but at least some Syriac authors, probably from a very authoritative teacher for the Church of the East, Theodore of Mopsuestia, argue that actually Syriac, or at least Aramaic, remember Syriac is a dialect of Aramaic, was the primordial language. And so it is true that Abraham is called a Hebrew, but the idea is Hebrew is actually a corruption of Aramaic. So Hebrew comes from the term for crossing over the Euphrates. So Abraham was a Chaldean. He spoke southern Mesopotamia, where Mani is from. He spoke southern Aramaic. And when he crossed the Euphrates to go to Canaan, it mixed with Canaanite religion language and became corrupt Hebrew. So this is the idea for Syriac or Aramaic as the primordial language. If we look at the synagogue of Dura Europos, a border town in Roman Syria, there's a fascinating synagogue. It has a number of figural paintings, and this is Abraham depicted as an astronomer. So Abraham, Jewish tradition at this point, saw Abraham as a Chaldean, a Babylonian, and the inventor of astrology, which was heavily associated with Chaldea or Babylon. So you note the sun and the moon there. So anyway, people are debating about what is the earliest language, and it seems like at this point Mani got started debating about what the earliest script was. So, and this, I argue, is part of this transition between from orality to textuality, or at least a mix. So we have, this is from a Manichaean text from the Silk Road in a dialect of Iranian called Parthian. We actually, in our edition of the Coptic Chester Beatty Kephaliah, we found a parallel version of this episode. So Mani is debating this. It's unclear whether he's a Buddhist Gundesh is definitely a Buddhist. Whether he's from the Iranian or Indian cultural sphere is unclear. But in any case, the fragmentary dialogue goes, Gundesh asks the beneficent one, that is Mani, which script is it that is foremost, and of all the scripts of the whole world has precedence? And the beneficent one said to him, there are 3 scripts that are earlier than all, the Indian, the Syrian, and Greek. And then, of course, it trails off, and we don't actually get Mani's argument for why the Syrian is the earliest, but he's talking about the Aleph. So it's clear that Mani here puts forward an argument that it's actually the Syrian script that is the earliest. So primordial language, primordial script. One of the reasons I think he's wrote the Living Gospel in 22 letters. And just to give you a kind of, on my comparative religion hat, the Mahavastu is a Buddhist text which includes the life of the Buddha, written in the Kushan period at about the time of Mani, and there is similar kind of discourse on what is the earliest script, or who at least is behind the invention of script. Also a transition from orality to textuality going on in Kushan. And there it's identified with the Bodhisattvas. So the Bodhisattvas are the ones who created all the scripts of the world. So this is less about which script is first, but who wrote them. And it seems like the Bodhisattvas have cornered the market on inventing scripts. So the Greek, the Brahmi, the Kharoshthi, which is Aramaic-derived script at this time. So it goes on to say that the Buddhists invented all of these scripts. So this debate, I'm simply saying, was in the air. Okay, so now I'm going to make a more detailed argument about alphabetic theology and how Mani's Living Gospel is kind of saying very similar things and doing similar things with scribal practices like the alphabet to the Zoroastrians at this time. So if we look at the Ahuna Vairya prayer, it's the probably not a scholar of Zoroastrianism, but probably the most sacred prayer of the Zoroastrian tradition. It's in the Old Avestan. It's made up of 21 words, and we know, at least according to a Sasanian theological treatise, the Denkard, that the Avesta was organized into 21 nasks, divisions, and that each of the words of the Ahuna Vairya mantra was a title for that nask. So exactly as Mani has got 22, his Living Gospel has got 22 chapters, and each is a letter of the Aramaic alphabet. We have this situation with the Ahuna Vairya. And this kind of, it's not, in this case, it's not an alphabet yet, it's a word, but it's a similar indexical function. And we also have this mantra, according to Zoroastrian tradition. Why is it so holy? Well, it was the primordial language present at the creation. So God spoke it before Ahura Mazda is the god of light or justice, spoke it before he created the material universe. And Zoroaster, the revealer, the prophet of Zoroastrianism, was the first person to speak it. So primordial language in terms of cosmogony, primordial language in terms of revelation, and it's used as an index for the sacred scripture of the Zoroastrians. We have similar stuff going on in the Buddhist world in Gandhara, again, so the Lalita Vistara, another of these 3rd century texts. Buddha, this is chronicling Buddha as a young boy, and he's in the classroom. And in the classroom, he's basically showing up his teachers. He basically miraculously causes them to be able to learn the alphabet. And in this, in the process of doing that, for each Sanskrit letter that he teaches them, that's the first word in a doctrinal teaching. So it's not indexical in the exact sense that the Living Gospel and the Ahuna Vairya are for the Avesta, but it's a similar thing going on there. So a kind of alphabetic understanding of Scripture. For those of you interested in apocryphal Christian literature, there's an interesting parallel here with the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, where there's a precocious young Jesus who shows up his teacher who is trying to teach him the alphabet, and Jesus says, "Oh, you think you know about the alpha? Let me tell you about the alpha." And he gives him a rundown of the significance of the alpha's shape. Anyway, I'm not going to, time-wise, I'm not going to get into the details here. But anyway, from a Manichaean hymn to the Father, which is probably based on the Living Gospel itself in 22 verses, we see the Father described as the primeval voice that created the world, so the cosmogony, the primeval word of revelation. For Mani, revelation is something that happens at the beginning to Adam and comes again and again, and the primeval messenger is the one often identified with Jesus the Splendor, who gives this message of revelation, which has been repeated, and the only pure version of it now is in Mani's Living Gospel. So again, we have this notion of the primeval voice and the primeval word are playing on this idea of Aramaic as a sacred language, and then we'll see that Aramaic in Mani's writing of the Living Gospel has also become a sacred script. I'm going to skip some of this again because of time. There's just a parallel of Mandean alphabetic theology. Remember, the Mandeans are the Baptists, so probably just to show you that at the same period, there's a lot of this alphabetic speculation. The Manichaeans and Mandeans also have hymns, which are abecedarian, they're called, so they're basically verses based on the letters of the alphabet. So it's not just a scriptural thing, it's also heavily invested in the liturgy. Okay, so what I want to do, actually, let me fast forward a little bit. So Mani wrote the Living Gospel in Aramaic, but he quickly translated it into other languages. He translated it into Parthian, and he translated it into Middle Persian. He did that because he's an Aramaic speaker, but living in the Persian Empire, he wanted to spread the message. So he translated it. Aramaic is a sacred language, so what happens when you translate the sacred language? Is it the same? Is it not as good? So what Mani did was, or his followers, they used an Aramaic script to write a slightly modified Aramaic script to write their translations of their scriptures in Middle Persian. So non-sacred language, the Zoroastrians thought Iranian was sacred, the Manichaeans said no, it's Aramaic, but a sacred script is what I'm going to argue. That's the Manichaean letters. It's, for those of you who know Syriac, it's recognizable, although there are some differences. Anyway, if we want to look at this idea of divine revelation as both in script or in language, and both of these being important, we can look no further than the Babylonian Talmud. So there's a debate here. So Rav Hizda said, Marukba said, originally the Torah was given to Israel in Hebrew script and the Holy Tongue. Later in the time of Ezra, the Torah was given in the Assyrian script and the Aramaic language. They selected for Israel the Assyrian script and the Holy Tongue, leaving the Hebrew script and the Aramaic for the simple folk. So basically, the argument here is that the Scripture has been revealed, and every revelation of Scripture is a written event as well as an oral one, and you can actually mix and match. And in fact, that's what they're doing, according to the rabbis, in this period. They're using the Assyrian script and the Holy Tongue to write their Torah scrolls. And in fact, we have a later, I'm not going to get into the details of the rabbinic debate here, but what's important for my argument Rav, who's a famous bishop, says there's no contradiction here. One passage refers to books written in our font, the other to books written in their foreign font. What he's saying, believe me, or take my word for it, don't necessarily believe me, is that it doesn't matter what language it's written in. It's okay to have a translation of the Torah as long as it's written in the sacred script, his Aramaic script. So I think what's going on here is that in Babylonia, this is one aspect of a discourse on sacrality of script, and this is an endorsement of translating the Torah as long as you use the Jewish Aramaic script to write that translation. So that's precisely what's going on, I think, with Mani's Living Gospel. It translated into Persian, but using the Holy Aramaic script. Okay, and then just to end, a couple of interesting things about this kind of, I call what Mani does and what you get in the Ahuna Vairya, using, dividing a particular, in this case a single work, in other cases a corpus, into sections by the letters of the alphabet is a way to assert the completeness of that text as a revelation. It's a complete self-standing revelation. So it's kind of a type of proto-canonical discourse. We have the Iliad and the Odyssey in 24 books. There are many examples of this. 24 is the number of the Greek letters. Orpheus, who's the legendary inventor of the Greek script, his rhapsodes, this late antique phenomenon, are also in 24 books according to the letters of the Greek alphabet. We know that some counts of the Jewish canon were 22 books. The rabbis went back and forth between 22 and 24, but Origen argued that there are 22 books in the Old Testament canon because there are 22 letters in the Aramaic alphabet. And for the Syriac scholars in the room, I will venture the hypothesis. So the Peshitta is 22 books, and possibly that is a response to the 22 letters of Mani. So similar, the 22 books in the New Testament. Although I have to say, and I would be curious to hear if you know of any speculation in Syriac theologians about the number of books of the Peshitta, or if it's even discussed at all. Or and then I'll end with a quote from Ephraim. Ephraim is an Orthodox theologian from Nisibis, and he, interestingly enough, has a language-neutral alphabetic theology. So he doesn't really talk about it could be Alpha and the Omega in Greek that he's talking about, like in Revelation, or in Syriac. He says, like the form of the alphabet, which is complete in its parts, it lacks no letter, nor does it add another. So too is the truth written in the Holy Gospel with the letters of the alphabet, a perfect measure that admits neither lack nor surplus. And then the response is, blessed is your image that is in the alphabet. This is from the Hymns Against Manichaeism. So it's a kind of playing on this alphabetic proto-canonical discourse. Okay, thank you.